safety and environment. In this nugget, we'll be discussing safety and environmental issues. One of the first things you got to be careful of is to identify any potential hazards. As long as you can identify it, you can formulate a plan for what to do if something bad does happen or to prevent it from happening in the first place. And you also want to use preventive maintenance measures to make sure that your systems don't go down prematurely. We also want to identify the best way to dispose of various types of hazardous equipment, such as batteries and certain kinds of metals. And we want to make sure that we do that safely, both for the personnel as well as to protect the environment. You know, I found that in life, as well as in certain A-plus objectives, you have to really be prepared in advance for certain things. For example, here in Phoenix, we have to prepare our homes against the onslaught of spring and summer because it's that time of year that we can get invaders in our homes. No, it's not things like cockroaches and spiders. It's things like this, Arizona bark scorpions, which can flatten themselves to the thickness of a credit card and make their way in through any nook and cranny in your home. They're really just chasing food like crickets. So we try to kill crickets because these things are almost immune to most legal pesticides. 2 nights ago, I was laying in bed, sound asleep, and I felt a tickle on my chest, and I realized, well, it's not the wife, she's out of town, and so I kind of just brushed it off almost out of reflex, and I got a wicked sting from one of these Arizona bark scorpions. And then I spent the next hour tearing the room apart trying to find this thing. Never could find it. So then eventually, about 2 or 3 in the morning, I got back into bed and tried to sleep, but you can imagine that thereafter, every little tickle or itch that I would feel, I'd jolt out of bed just assuming that it was that bark scorpion trying to inject me full of more neurotoxins that appear in this tail right here in this little reservoir, which is, you know, quite painful among other things. The other thing it's supposed to do is to paralyze its prey. For me, it probably just killed a few brain cells or something. Of course, as I'm sure you're aware, I don't really have that many brain cells to spare in the first place. But what we have to do is to look for any kind of potential hazards, whether it's scorpions getting into your home or workplace safety. And so we need to identify those potential hazards and also safety plans for if something does go wrong. Now, the whiteboards for this video, much like my other videos, have pretty much derived items from the exact exam objectives. I just summarized those and put them up here for you so that we can address them. One thing that appears many times on the A+ exam objectives is this thing where you don't touch the inside of power supplies and monitors. I've already beaten that dead horse enough. I think you get the point there. So I just identified as one of the objectives here, and we'll move on to environmental issues where you want to have a safe work environment and to avoid trip hazards. Now, that is mostly common sense. And by the way, a lot of this stuff is really common sense that we can just allow to prevail. But if you have a network cable, for example, that's running across a hallway because maybe you're moving offices or something, and the only way you could do this would be to temporarily set up a workstation in a certain location where you wouldn't normally expect to see it. The nearest RJ45 jack is across the hall. Well, one thing to consider is wireless if you can secure it properly. The other thing, though, is if you don't have any choice, you might have to string a network cable across the hall there. One thing you want to do, though, is to secure it properly. Now, what I like to do, if it's really a temporary situation, is I can just take gaffer's tape, which is usually several inches wide, and it's a lot like duct tape, but it's not quite the same type of adhesive, and it pulls up more easily, and it's easier to manage. So I would tape that down at the very least. But if people are moving, dollies across that cable and, moving heavy filing cabinets and things, it's a good chance that they'll fray that cable or that they'll break one of the wires inside of it. So again, you have a drawback to that. The other thing you could do would be to put a cable guard over it, and that's one of those things that's kind of shaped in a rounded shape like this, kind of like a speed bump, and here's the floor down here, and then you got the speed bump looking thing over there, and you've seen these before, I'm sure, and then the cable runs underneath here, and there's usually a support under this as well, so that if someone does step on it or roll on top of it, that it does not crush the entire thing. It kind of provides a support system under there so that your cables in here don't get crushed. And then we also have liquid hazards that could occur as well. Now, as far as liquids are concerned, I know that here in Phoenix, man, it's the time of year where it's really starting to get hot. It hasn't even been spring yet at this time of year, and yet we're already receiving summer temperatures. We broke 3 records last week. The average temperatures usually, I think, in the lower 70s. We reached 96 degrees recently. So we're way above average in temperature, but that makes us all thirsty. I mean, it's dry and hot in Arizona. Summertime, we get up to like 115 degrees. Man, we're defensive about having liquids around our workstations. We want to drink desperately. We kind of feel like if we don't get a drink, we're going to shrivel up like a raisin. But in some workplaces, they might not even allow liquids near computers because there's such a hazard with if the drink gets spilled that it could get into the computer, cause an electrical short, cause even a fire in the worst case scenario, or at the very least ruin a keyboard that would have to be replaced. So liquids are kind of a workplace hot button in many locations. Some places that do allow liquids say you can have one as long as it has a lid on it. So nothing like an open mug of coffee, for example, because there's no lid on that. If you have one of those stainless steel ones with a lid on top that you can sip out of, then that might be okay. Or a bottle of water, or a can of soft drink, or something like this. Those things might all be okay because even if they spill over, they usually just dribble out a little bit, and usually even by reflex you can pick it up in time before there's a huge spill that's taken place. Of course, I'm not here to legislate what kind of company policy you should have, but just be aware of the potential hazard that we do have there. Let me point this out. If you do spill a drink or some kind of liquid inside of a keyboard, mostly just throw it away and get another one. It's not worth the effort to clean it out, dry it out, test it, see if you're still having problems. If the keys are still sticking because there was a cola spilled in it or something like that, to do the whole thing over again. I mean, it can take a lot more time than it's really worth, and you can get new keyboards for like $10 or something. So be well worth it just to get another one. Plus, some of the keyboards nowadays also have integrated circuits in them, and there's just too good of a chance that you could have burnt something out and created an unpredictable situation there. So the other thing you want to be aware of are situational problems in the environment. And as much as anything, this really just means being aware of your surroundings. If you are an on-site technician and you go to different buildings and different workplaces and different homes even to work on these computers, make sure that you're aware of the different potential hazards that are around that could cause a problem, such as liquid or trip hazards. And then another thing to be aware of in terms of your situational awareness is the atmosphere where you're working. For example, in a lot of places, it's really too hot. And we've talked about heat before, but I know even in my own office, I've got, I don't even know how many, I guess at least 4 computers on at all times, and at least 2 monitors, and behind me there's 2 laser printers. So I got a lot of heat generating devices in here, and it's just not enough air conditioning in this house to cool off this room. I had to put in a separate air conditioner to take care of that atmospheric problem of too much heat being generated. The other thing to be considerate of there is in terms of anything that could cause additional static electricity. For example, I also am in a high static environment. I've got those laminate floors. It looks like it's some kind of pine or something like that, or maple, I guess. But if you touch it, you see it's really just made of plastic. Well, guess what? That's a great way to generate static electricity. So that's another thing that I have to consider. I have to make sure that things are well grounded, that I'm always using an ESD strap when I work on internal components while I'm in my office. And if I have my little miniature bench out, or if I have my little anti-static pad out, that I properly ground that as well. So I know for me, some atmospheric things to consider there. And of course, in Arizona, it's very dry as well, which contributes even more to static electricity. Some places recommend that if you can, try to get the humidity levels up to about 50%, and you can put humidification devices into the room to be able to help bring that up a little bit. Also, be aware of just, again, high voltage issues. And that's really been addressed mostly in these 2 things up here at the top, which we already discussed. But another thing to be careful of in terms of potential hazards is moving equipment. Hey, you know what? Especially guys, I don't know what it is about us, but we seem to have the tendency to think, oh, that's not too heavy for me. I can lift that thing. Well, that's what everybody says until they wrench their back. And then suddenly, even the lightest things seem pretty heavy because they're very painful to pick up. So be very careful about moving equipment, and don't be overly ambitious or try to show off too much. And the main thing here is to always get help if you pick up something that's heavy. And your company may have a pound limit. Anything 50 pounds or heavier, for example, always get someone else to help you with. Also, there's kind of sometimes some places it's written and some places it's not. But some companies will just say, if you feel that something is too heavy for you, always get help. For example, maybe you have other physical disabilities or you've had a history of back problems. Well, maybe your limit's going to be 30 or 40 pounds. So just always err on the side of caution with anything relating to a potential hazard. And if something bad does happen, know how to handle that accident. So for example, if you have an employee that picks up a box that turned out to be too heavy for him or for her, and they do wrench their back, don't just tell them to take a couple of Doan's pills and come back in the morning and they'll be just fine. You may have to have a company policy that requires any kind of accident to be reported. This protects both the employee as well as the company in terms of liabilities. It also has certain things to do with things like workers' compensation issues. And there are, of course, many legalities regarding handling accidents that are beyond my scope and more in the terms of a human resources kind of requirements for workplace safety. But the A-plus exam objectives just call for us to be able to know how to handle accidents or to have a plan in place for if a certain kind of an accident would happen. All right, then as far as preventive maintenance is concerned, we have some things to address here as well. First of all, the A-plus exam objectives call for a visual and audio inspection for preventive maintenance on personal computer components. Now, first of all, how obvious can you be? If you see something wrong, fix it. Okay, moving on. If you hear something wrong, fix it. Now, that could be in a couple of respects. There's only a couple of things that are actually going to make any kind of a noise. Actually, three things. Number one would be a sound card itself. If the sound card is making a strange noise, usually it's going to be something like a static type of a noise. That very often means that 1/8" jack in the back of the sound card is not plugged in all of the way. So just plug that in the remainder of the way, and usually that's going to address the situation. And the other part of that could be if the sound cable that comes out of that back of that sound card is going near some other electrical components that are highly interfering with the sound, then that could also cause an issue. Another kind of a thing that would make sound is any kind of a mechanical device. What kind of mechanical devices do we have? Primarily, it's going to be printers. Usually, if you hear something that makes a strange sound inside of the printer, it could mean that you need to replace the maintenance kit or order a new maintenance kit and replace the rollers and potentially any cogs and so forth. If you hear any grinding noises in there, that very often is going to be indicative of the fact that someone has forced that printer. They might have jerked a page out of the printer before it was completely gone through. It might have stripped off some cogs of something. So listen for those kinds of strange noises coming from your printer. And then as far as the PC itself is concerned, let's look at it this way. If for just a moment I disabled all the fans, if I could do that, if I just turned off all the fans inside of that computer for just a moment, what noise would it be making? Well, none. No, there's no other moving parts normally inside of a computer. That's the only thing that really can make noise is the fans. So if you hear something that's strange about the computer, number one, it'll be that it's too quiet, meaning that it's potentially that a fan could have failed, or number two, that it's making too much noise. For example, if a fan starts to go out, it'll often make a grinding noise or sound like one of the blades is tapping up against something. And that could simply be that a cable has kind of come loose or it's drifted over towards the fan and it's rubbing against one of the blades. That's an easy fix, just move that cable. But sometimes also those fans will have various bearings in them, and if those start to go out, then it'll just start making strange noises as well. So check those things. And then we've talked about this in the past as well. Keep your drivers and your firmware up to date. There's some degree to which we say if it's not broken, don't fix it. But on the other hand, a lot of times new drivers will help to resolve problems in advance so that you don't have a troubleshooting problem that comes down the pike that you could have fixed if you would have just updated the driver in the first place. And the same kind of principle there applies to firmware as well. You should also schedule preventive maintenance, and this can take place in a lot of different ways. It could be in relation to dust and cleaning out the inside of that computer. It could relate to cleaning things. And for the most part, in terms of cleaning, it's just you clean it when it gets dirty. So I don't know if you can really schedule that. But certain things you can schedule might be things such as running a disk defragmentation, because of course over time those disks become fragmented. A lot of products nowadays, especially executive software's disk keeper product, will have an automated feature where it can automatically detect the amount of fragmentation, and so you're pretty much hands off at that point. As soon as it detects a certain threshold, it'll automatically defragment that drive, or you can schedule it to happen every night at 3 a.m. or whenever you want that to happen. And we've also talked about the various tools in a previous nugget, the tools that you use to work on computers. And then we've also talked to some degree about cleaning. Now, in terms of cleaning, probably the biggest thing you'll have to be concerned about really is going to be blowing out the dust on the inside of a computer case. You can do this by using one of two methods. Number one, you can use a can of compressed air, or you can use a vacuum, not just any vacuum, because they will generate a severe amount of electrostatic potential, so you don't want to have a discharge go on inside of that computer. But there are certain kinds of ESD-safe computers that you could use. And then here's an example of one of those ESD-safe vacuums. And you can see I've just gone to allspec.com to look at this. And this is also a HEPA vacuum, which means that it's going to filter out 99.97% efficiency of the various dust and molds and other harmful contaminants that could be sucked into that vacuum. And then here's just another view of it, a bigger picture of it if you want to take a look at that. So again, this is going to be ESD safe. It's not going to generate or discharge static electricity. Again, you can use that on the inside of the computer. Now, another thing that I want to point out here is in terms of the dust that builds up in the computer, here are just some examples of it. Number one, this is an intake fan. This actually is the outside of the computer. This is one of those plexiglass types of panels that appears instead of a door on some of the computers. A lot of gamers are using this kind of thing nowadays. And this is the intake fan where you can see it's sucked in quite a lot of dust. Now, if you look at this and in terms of scheduling preventive maintenance, you see that it's accumulated this much dust in maybe a year, then maybe you ought to have a preventive plan in place every 6 to 8 months to blow out the dust and clean this thing off. Since this is the exterior of the computer, I could use a conventional vacuum on this because it's going to have proper grounding and everything as would be necessary. Anything on the outside of the computer you could use a normal vacuum for if you wanted to. It's the inside that you certainly don't want to use a conventional vacuum. And of course, it would also make very little sense to use a can of compressed air to blow this because it's just going to blow dust inside of the computer past these fan blades and right on into the inside. So I wouldn't want to do that. Another example of some dust issues that we might see would be this one right here. This computer actually uses a filter, and this filter appears in front of the intake fans. That helps to prevent dust from getting inside of the computer and all over the fans. And then every now and then, you simply take this thing out. You can use a can of compressed air to blow all of this off of there. You would probably want to go outside to do that so you don't further contaminate other components on the inside of the office or building. It's also going to be less of an irritant to those people that are sensitive to dust. It's possible that you could also wash this if you want to. Look at the manufacturer's instructions there. Most of the time you can. You just have to make sure that it's thoroughly dried before you put it back into the computer. And then finally, we're going to have another kind of a dust example here. That's this one. Look at that mess. Jeez, I don't know. Whoever computer this is, man, if they're A+ certified, they probably ought to have their certification permanently revoked. Okay, I'll admit, this is my computer. But what happens here is I have a dog, and I have a picture of him. This is an Australian dingo, and he sheds profusely twice a year. And so that's another environmental concern, at least in my home, is that this dog releases a lot of hair, and as a result, it gets into the fan, just like we can see right here. So I have to be very careful during certain times of the year to keep this very clean. And again, this is actually a place where I could use a conventional vacuum, and that's what I use to clean this with, because we're actually looking still at the exterior of the computer. There's a door that swings open, but I'm still not on the inside, so I just, take a little brush attachment, put it on the hose, and then vacuum all of this off, and it works pretty well. And again, this is another kind of a repeat item. We talked about the environment in the previous slide here, previous whiteboard, but this is another one of those things that does repeat itself many times on the A+ exam objective, including under the preventive maintenance headings that you'll see there. So again, just make sure that your environment is proper in terms of the air quality, for example. You might want to also include certain things such as air filtration to reduce the amount of dust in the environment. A lot of server rooms, for example, are going to have that. You can also make sure that the temperature is proper, the humidity, there's no trip hazards and the like. And then we can also work with various input devices for preventive maintenance. Now, what kind of preventive maintenance would you use on something like a keyboard? We've talked about that before, where you can just blow out underneath the keys using a can of compressed air. Another thing that you might consider, and again, I usually just buy a new keyboard every 8 months or a year, but another thing you might consider if you're really on a shoestring budget and you don't want to buy a new keyboard is you can, for certain keyboards, soak them with demineralized water. That way when the water dries, it doesn't leave a residue with minerals in it that could cause certain problems. And of course, if there are electronic components in that keyboard, or rather integrated circuits of any kind, you wouldn't soak those, but you could disassemble it, and then as far as the mechanical parts of it, like the keys themselves and things like this, you might be able to soak those for a while. As far as your mouse is concerned, if you turn that over and look at it, you'll notice that there's usually a ring. Like if this is a ring that appears on the bottom of the mouse, and on the inside of that ring is the actual ball that rolls around on the desk or on the mouse pad, and that's what you use to track yourself inside of that. Now, there's usually two wheels underneath there as well. There's one wheel that goes this way, there's another wheel that goes this way, and that's how it tracks your X and Y coordinates, because these, this one goes this way. As you roll the mouse, this one, of course, goes the other way. And you've probably seen this before. What you would do then is you would just rotate this ring around and take it off. Almost all of them are removable, or they should be. Then what you can do is to use a cotton swab of some kind that you soak with denatured alcohol or isopropyl alcohol. Either one should be fine for this. One thing you do have to be careful of is certain kinds of alcohol can actually dry out rubber components, so make sure that you don't do something like that. In my view, you can use those kinds of alcohol that I just mentioned, but some people say not to use any kind of alcohol because it dries out the rubber and it can make the ball not roll properly along the rubber. But once again, mouses or mices or whatever, what's the plural there? Mice, I guess. Those things, we replace those every so often anyway, and so I don't think that's going to be an overall long-term issue there. But some people, if you want to be very strict about it, would only use a mild soap and water on these things. Now, of course, if it's an optical mouse, which is in increasing popularity, you don't really have any cleaning other than to make sure there's not somehow gotten to be excessive dust or debris underneath the mouse into the little place where the light is emitted. Because if light's not properly being emitted, it won't be able to properly track where you're moving that mouse. And then there's the issue of batteries. Geez, what do you do in terms of preventive maintenance for batteries? Generally, if a battery expires or it gets too low on a charge, you throw it away. That's the preventive maintenance. Throw the battery away and replace it with a fresh one, especially if it's like something before a major presentation. Maybe you have a battery-powered mouse of some kind. If you need to replace the batteries in it, like is the case with a lot of those new wireless ones that we use, replace that before you go on a major trip or make a major presentation or do something important. Nowadays, a lot of those mice that are have rechargeable batteries in them instead, and they can even be charged through a USB connection. So that's pretty handy. Otherwise, you would have UPS batteries, and for those items, you just want to periodically run a battery test to see whether or not they're able to maintain the load properly. It's been estimated that about every 3 years, you need to replace those UPS batteries, and be careful of how you dispose of those, by the way, for environmental concerns. Now, in terms of the environment, in terms of the planet, we have various disposal issues to think about because we do want to, of course, protect our planet and to make sure that hazardous materials don't leak into groundwater and things like that. And a lot of these kinds of things that I've listed here will cause problems with the environment, like batteries. Of course, they're going to leak acid. Acid is very, very seldom, if ever, good for much of anything. So that certainly could cause problems. We also have display units, especially CRTs, which are going to have phosphorus material on the inside of the monitor. That's something that we don't want to get into landfills either. And of course, chemical solvents and cans could also address certain kinds of issues. Chemical solvents, of course, are destructive in nature. And then as far as cans are concerned, a lot of those have a lot of compressed pressure inside of them, and we wouldn't want those to explode in certain disposal scenarios. So I'll be careful about how those are disposed of. And you can check with your local area in terms of how to dispose of all of these things, as well as computers themselves, because computers have a lot of things, a lot of kinds of metals in them that can be recycled. Recycling is a big issue, and you can recycle a lot of these things. You can check for a local area nearby you by going to the EPA.gov if you live in the United States. And they will list for you a lot of recycling centers or the nearest recycling center for you. Also check in any nearby area for you. A lot of times you can just go to Google and check to see whether you have a nearby one. But there are also a lot of manufacturers these days, such as Hewlett-Packard, which will allow you to send back to them their original equipment that you bought from them when it becomes obsolete. And when you do that, very often they will pay for the postage itself, or not the postage, but the shipping expenses and everything, and then they will take care of the recycling. A couple other things to consider there for printing issues is that even though I don't recommend that you get reused inkjet cartridges for your own use because the quality is not as good, you can take your own inkjet cartridges and submit them to various print houses and print companies that will recycle those and give them to somebody else so that they get less quality. At least that's my opinion of it. But at least you've recycled those cartridges. For toner cartridges, I usually don't have a problem with recycling those and reusing those unless they've been used too much, and then the drum itself might start to develop problems. But at least in terms of the environment, you can recycle those things and avoid throwing them into a landfill. Another thing you might consider, and this is just, again, my personal opinion on this one, is give stuff away. Hey, man, if it's still something like an older computer that you can't use anymore. For example, I've had some older ones that just don't play my Battlefield 1942 game very well. Well, then I can give that away to somebody else. Now, initially, I kind of feel guilty. I mean, like, geez, I'm giving somebody else my old junk. Why would they want that? Well, if it's a nonprofit organization or a charity or something that's on a low budget, it's probably more than they had in the first place, and so they, I'm sure, would still be grateful for a lot of those things, and hopefully they'll just be honest with you if they really can't use it because it's just too obsolete. The other thing you might consider there is donating things like old printers as well. In fact, I just got back from a nonprofit organization not too long ago where I saw someone had delivered to them probably about a dozen old Hewlett-Packard LaserJet 4L printers. At the time they came out, they were pretty cool. Nowadays, they're not that fast compared to what you can get nowadays. But it's more than that place had in the first place, and they were very grateful to receive them. And most of those printers still had at least a partial toner cartridge in them as well, which was well worth receiving also. In this nugget, we addressed safety and environmental concerns. We started off by identifying various types of hazards that could cause a problem for your computer, such as trip hazards or liquids or voltage issues. We looked at several of those things that we want to try to avoid. And then we can also kind of buy ourselves some time in preventing various types of maintenance from happening or troubleshooting scenarios from happening by using preventive maintenance, keeping things clean, keeping the dust out of things, making sure that we're looking and listening for any kinds of potential problems. And we also identified the various ways that we can dispose of equipment and the various kinds of things we don't want to just throw in the landfill, such as batteries, or old monitors, especially CRT monitors. And remember, you can always check with local resources to identify how to properly recycle various types of materials. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.